All right, great. So we're going to change topics a little bit now. The topic of the next panel is multi-cloud and cloud lock-in. With me are Joe Cardenas from Google Cloud Platform. He's a customer engineer and works with organizations to implement GCP. And Harm Weites, who's a technical lead at Dutch e-commerce website Whekamp, which is the second largest e-commerce site in Holland, and he manages the company's IT infrastructure. So thanks to you both for being here, especially Harm, who flew in from Holland to be here with us, so thank you. Just to frame the topic, so Mary Meeker from Kleiner Perkins, who's formerly one of the top tech analysts on Wall Street, she publishes a report every year called Internet Trends. And this year what was interesting, I thought, was she polls IT managers, people that have purchasing budget for cloud and, frankly, any tech spend with their companies. And she's done this for the last 5 years. If you look back 5 years ago and she asks, what are your biggest concerns with the cloud? If you go back 5 years, the top concern, not surprisingly, was security. 45% of respondents said concerned about security. Close to security, number two, is ROI. Am I getting a return on my investment if I shift from on-premise spending to cloud spending? Way low on the list, about 5% of respondents responded with lock-in, being locked into any one vendor. You fast forward to today, 5 years later, and this report was published in May. Security is still a top concern. It's come down a little bit. ROI has gone way down. People are getting return from their spend. They see the value in moving to cloud. And lock-in, by far, jumped the most, not only over the last 5 years, but also over the past year. Now 26% of respondents are citing that as one of their top three concerns. So that's sort of the framing of the subject we want to explore and talk about with both of you. So Joe, I'll start with you. Mm-hmm. That's a general framing. Talk more about why this is an important topic.
Well, it's important. Like for me, when I talk with customers and work with customers, what's interesting is they either are in two worlds for multi-cloud. For one, it's they're using a different provider or multiple providers because they see benefits in each. And with that, it comes with where your data is located, how you network that. On the other side, it's I want a DR site in a different redundancy zone or a different regional zone. I want it on a different cloud provider. But the interesting is knowing what you're building on top of. That's really important. If you're going multi-cloud or if you're afraid of vendor lock-in, you want to integrate open source technologies. You want to make your immutable infrastructure. That's really important for you to be able to say, hey, I like this provider, I like that provider. It gives the customer the control.
And so, Harm, we talked a little bit more about kind of what multi-cloud means for you. Speak a little bit about your infrastructure, about where you guys are. You've been around for a number of years. You run on-premise equipment. You run cloud-based equipment. Talk more about that.
Yeah. So we operate both like an on-premise system and a cloud system with Amazon. And each step we've taken so far is about basically considerations and taking options into account. So for example, we've been running a Postgres database, and we figured, well, things are getting bleak, and Amazon has an option for this. So it's not so much about a lock-in, but it's more about exploring the options that are there and making best use of the options that are given. But it's still, just like you said, Joe, it's still open source technology. So we get additional benefits like backups and restore plans. But we don't have to go through the hassle of deploying a Postgres machine. We can just flip a switch using one simple API call, and there you have it. You have your database instance, whether it be in region A or B, or whether it be in just about anywhere on the planet. It's just one simple API call.
And do you think about different services or different applications differently? Meaning, are there some applications or some services where you would be more concerned about being locked in your case, to Amazon? It could just as well be Azure or Google. In other cases, you're willing to sort of take that risk for the immediate benefit. How do you think about that and trade off the costs and the benefits?
Well, when we started with cloud, which was about 3 years ago, we were in this situation where we had an on-premise setup, and it didn't work out. It was slow, and due to various reasons, we couldn't interact with this platform the way we wanted to. And then there was Amazon. Back then, it was the only valid option. Google just wasn't it just yet. So we chose Amazon for a good reason, because we needed to ship our product. We needed to ship our website. So back then, it was basically the only option to getting work done. And that's what drove us back then, at least, towards Amazon. And we always planned on using the least amount of you could arguably say, proprietary features from Amazon. Mm-hmm. We always kept in mind, well, there will be a day when we're going to move towards either Google or Azure or any other provider of choice. But we need to keep the option open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. If you look back sort of over even 30, 40 years, every time there's been a significant sort of new technology, new wave like cloud is today, right? You kind of look back in the 70s, 80s, the IBM mainframe, right? You kind of look back with Oracle in the 90s when there's sort of a big movement. It comes with incredible benefits, right? And it often, almost always, results in a single or a very small number of large technology companies that lock in their customers. And so you look forward today, we're still at the early stages of cloud, right? But you could see that, the risk of that sort of starting to happen. And I think in our conversations with folks like you, with other customers, there's some realization of it, but you often hear, especially for small startups, that we have to get it out there. We have to get it started. Of course, all big companies start as small startups that have to move quickly, right? So if Joe, you work with a lot of different companies doing this. Does that kind of sort of reflect what you're seeing? And then, go ahead.
It kind of makes sense. I get it. You work with a vendor, you a cloud provider, but the interesting thing is you have that choice. At the end of the day, it's a foundation. You just have VMs. You're building on top of these VMs. So if you make the conscious choice to make immutable infrastructure, make a CI/CD pipeline, use containerization, you as a customer have the choice to move wherever you want. And at that point, you get to choose the best provider. You're not locked in somewhere. And that's a really valid, important thing to do.
So why isn't everyone doing this?
Maybe they don't have the know-how, or things are working right now. They're not worried about it. But it's something that everyone should be talking about. It's a great trend to see. I follow the Internet Trends Report every year, and seeing cloud just grow is fantastic because it changes the conversation. Before it was, what is cloud? How can I use cloud? Now it's, how can I use your cloud? How can I make cloud the best for me? And that's what I want to do with customers. But I mean, every customer should be thinking about that. How do I build on open source, and how do I treat VMs and these things as commodities?
And who's doing it? Who's doing it? Well, who's doing it, I suppose. Yeah. And who's doing it? Who's doing it well?
Right now, I'd say people that have moved to the bleeding edge on like what's available today. If you're building everything out in a microservices model and you're using things like Docker, like Kubernetes or Mesos, that's a great way to build. It doesn't matter where you are. You just have these containers. You can move them over to a different cloud provider or on-prem. It doesn't matter. You can run a minikube. But that gives you the power. They're doing it well. People that aren't doing well haven't even thought about this. They're building on the old way they do things. There's library dependencies on every single VM. And for them, moving from one VM to another is a big issue. It's not a Jenkins pipeline. It's just, oh my gosh, we got to spin up a new VM. We got to spend time building this out, where it should be, like that.
And are there any? I'll ask the same question I asked to Harm. Are there drawbacks to doing this? Is there?
Well, you're on the bleeding edge. If you're not very conversant on like how to handle containerization networking, there's a lot of open source technology on top of that, and you can contribute, you can work with that. But if it's very foreign to you, you don't even know where to start. But what makes sense is finding a POC first. First little product that you can peel away and say, hey, let's move this to a microservices model, is where you're going to kind of grow out and give yourself back that power.
So I'm not hearing very much counter argument to this as a
I think it's important for a customer to know their architecture. I mean, I'm biased. I work at Google. I'm on Google Cloud Platform. I'm helping clients build things out. But at the end of the day, I want them to get the best out of us. If I recommend something to them and I want to build with them, If they want to do open source on VMs, great. If they want to build containerization, that's great. But I want, there's open source tools out there to make sure that what you're getting is the best. We have this thing that we built out called PerfKit. You can just go run across all these cloud providers and test out their networking, their latency, their VM performance, and that's great for a customer to know.
Yeah, if your question was about counter arguments, if you look at the number of people reading Hacker News, if I'm taking our company as an example, the number of people reading Hacker News and with Hacker News just as a means of well, basically measuring their area of interest, that number is still pretty low. And the number of people actually having worked with a microservices architecture, or even the SOA architecture, which we've called it in the past, the number is still pretty slow, pretty low. So adoption of containers in general and this new way of handling your infrastructure, handling your code, even paradigms like immutable infrastructure as code in itself. That's just like Joe said, it's bleeding edge. And the number of people doing this trick is very, very limited. And that's probably one of the drivers behind adoption lagging by. And we've been doing it for 3 years now, but that's like half of the company. The other half of the company is still busy catching up, and busy catching up each and every day.
So you're saying it's really an awareness issue. We're still new.
Part of it is definitely about awareness. About you're no longer just operating on one single virtual machine named Betty. You're operating on a fairly larger scale. It's no longer about this machine, it's about your application. Mm-hmm. And you need to ship this application. And the way of doing that used to be just clicking buttons, because it was just one big legacy application, one monolithic application. And these days, we've got pipelines to deploy microservices, microsites, which makes it a lot easier. And adding to that, if your organizational structure does not allow you to do this, like for example, you don't have product teams that are fully in control, then also on that end, you need to catch up. We're very lucky at Whekamp to have product teams that are fully in control. And we've implemented site reliability engineering, adding to this, as a means to having proper metrics on how these product teams are performing from a reliability perspective. But it's about a full picture, mm-hmm. And there are not that many companies that have this picture all laid out for them.
Mm-hmm. You agree with that, Joe, that it's more of an awareness issue than an implementation, or that there's limitations to sort of how you do this?
For me, I work here in the Bay Area, so I imagine that the awareness of containerization and these kind of bleeding edge technologies is kind of more. They're built here. These are where these things are, the GitHub repos, or there's meetups around it. But yeah, I don't think there's enough people that know about it. When I talk with customers, I ask them, I'm like, hey, let's talk about a POC or something like that. Because I want them to see the power of that and why that's a beautiful thing for, making application development as easy as possible for your devs, where they don't really worry about VMs and IP tables and all these things. It's great. All they do is code, build a Docker file, move that over to DevOps, and DevOps says, yeah, I'll run this for you, and I'll orchestrate it and make sure that it's always up and running. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic.
And like I said it again, you don't lose anything by. What does this look like in 10 years and 15 years? And are we sort of in a world where you can just sort of easily port an application from one provider to another without losing very much, and kind of the person with spend has the power against the vendor, or we sort of is this sort of version 3 or version 4 of what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years?
Kind of like, it's a progression of technology. Bare metal was the old way of doing things, and then there was the hypervisor layer that moved that away. You don't really worry about bare metal anymore. And then beyond VMs now, it's the abstraction of the operating system level. It's the OS is gone anymore. You don't really care about libraries, etc. You can just code and move that wherever you want, which is great for DevOps, and it's also great for customers. And at the end of the day, the customer gets the best cloud they can get. For us, we don't want a partnership where someone works with us and they're like, oh man, the VMs aren't great. It makes us sad. We want to give them the best possible performance, and containers ensure that.
Harm, what do you think? If you look kind of forward in the future, you think about your process and other colleagues and peers you have at other companies. How does this play out, do you think?
I think what will happen is we'll begin basically checking out various cloud providers as they are, and we'll be looking at options each and every one offers, and just basically cherry picking whatever works best. If Amazon has a good proposition on virtual machines, then we'll take that. And if for instance, Google has a great proposition for big data solutions, then we'll obviously pick Google. And instead of forcefully using just one provider, we'll just go with whatever works best. And what will happen is the emerging abstraction layers will start to emerge. That's just to take away the hassle of directly connecting to either Amazon or Azure or Google. You'll just connect with one solution, and from that solution you can just flip a switch to point out it'll talk with Google or Azure or whatever cloud provider.
Are you doing that already? Are you sort of comparing services among different providers, kind of service by service, and seeing who has the best solution and how you might leverage that? Because there's two parts to this, right? One part is the risk of being locked into any one provider. The other part is actually going with the best-in-class service by service. Are you guys doing any of that?
No, we're as it is right now. We have far more trouble keeping our on-premise machines online. Mm-hmm. Well, in not literally, but that's far more. It outweighs any other topic, basically. We've got on-premise and we've got Amazon, and Amazon is just, it works. And we don't have the incentive of moving away from Amazon or exploring options beyond Amazon or for specific features products isn't that big. We need to take care of the on-premise machinery first. And that's something we'll be struggling with for the next couple of years.
But you could see yourself, I imagine, doing that over time.
Well, we have been looking already at Google's Kubernetes solution. But the trade-off would eventually the trade-off comes down to one very simple thing of why we're not doing it. Lack of people to actually do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe, how would you respond to that? I mean,
yeah, I was about to
working
say,
with Kubernetes, yeah.
That's what it would make sense. There's a priority list, and a dev team, a CTO, they're always worried about this priority list. I'm not worried about orchestration or containerization yet because I have this priority number one and priority number two. The thing is, it has to move up in priority because in that world, those other priorities don't become that important. If you move to the orchestration side and you move to the containerization, that on-prem goes away, or you can just put containers on their on-prem solution, move that over to another cloud provider, and you kind of can move between, and you get that choice. And I'm sure you want to be there. You want to say like, I can move this container wherever I want, but it has to be a priority. And there's fires to put out, and that's I talk with folks, and fires have to be put out first before that is something. But what makes sense is that POC, something small, something to start with that you can put a few devs on and move to that microservices model and grow that out. And that usually is the best way to move forward. No one wants to look at their infrastructure and say, all this has to change. If it's working, that's kind of hard to do. What makes sense is, there's a little piece here or this new project, let's move that over to microservices. Let's get it connected. It's not that difficult to do. And then run in that model. And then build that out. If it's working well, build that out.
So we have a few minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience for our panelists.
Hi, is it working? Yeah. My name is Nat, and I'm working at Medium. I had a question/reaction to that last debate around, going from cloud provider to cloud provider. You talked kind of extensively about containers, orchestration. We could talk about how you can run Lambda functions through some frameworks across different vendors. But it always comes down to that, it's not easy to move the data from one vendor to another. That's kind of the most critical part in the application. Like the compute, yeah, it's stateless, so you can move it. But how do you deal with the data? And I think that's why it's so hard for anyone right now to go across cloud vendor and stuff like that, because data locality matters for performance. So what's the story around that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a concern. Moving data from one provider to another, that costs money. That's egress. You're going over fiber networks to do that. But do you need to move everything? Sometimes you just need to move your analytics, and that's what you need to move. Or you need to move some user data. But thinking about moving everything, you're basically building a disaster recovery site. You don't need to do that. Or you can choose what's very pertinent and that you have to move. That kind of gives you that model. But yeah, you're right. You can't just say, hey, I'm here and I'm going to move everything over and incur these expenses. You have to make a conscious choice of, I only need this, and this needs to be moved back. That might make sense if you're kind of doing federated clusters or things of that sort.
Yeah, and one additional note would be, in the end, it'll just be open source technology. So if you're looking at the previous example about Postgres, if your concern is about data, you can just use any Postgres-capable, let's say Postgres library-based application to fetch your data and push it to your new cloud. And on top of that, you also have options like I don't know, Amazon's Direct Connect and Google's counterpart to make the transition to make this data flow more convenient. But yeah, moving around data is a thing if you're actively after going multi-cloud.
This is Bharat. I have a question. I work for Intact, and I have a question like, what's the trade-off between running an instances, like if you have a bare metal and you want to do a Docker containerization on the bare metal versus like if I want instances in the cloud, because it seems very nice to move the cloud from on-prem, move to cloud from on-prem, but what are the trade-offs? Like, should we have a more containerization locally or to go on the cloud to evaluate something?
There's this interesting concept of like Kubernetes the hard way. And if you run on-premise, you get Minikube, and you can run Kubernetes on top of that and run containers on it. The thing is, what's the beauty of Kubernetes, if something goes down, the replication service will just bring that back up. And that orchestration is beautiful. It's fantastic. It can scale up and down. And if you have a service that needs that, cloud is a better fit. It's hard to scale up and down with your on-premise resources. But if you just need to have like an intro to building your first container and moving it onto Kubernetes, that's a great first step. Moving that there and making sure that it works. And then let's say you want to move something else there. Now you have the ability to say, hey, this cloud provider, hopefully us, let's move this container over there. And then you can start moving more things to that Minikube on premise. And if you have a burstable application or bursting microservices, on premise probably not the best fit.
And you can abstract that to really any open source platform. You're bringing up Kubernetes, but there's other.
Unless you're building
that
servers super quick and
right,
don't matter
but that would
yeah.
You could abstract that beyond. Yeah. So I like the forceful question of we're trying to keep this agnostic from ourselves, obviously, and from Cloudflare. I mean, what I'd say to that is that, if you think about the number of applications and instances and services that you would run on any storage or any compute vendor, and you kind of compare that to an edge service, that admittedly will have more and more applications and features on it. And of course, I'm saying this as a representative of Cloudflare. I think even intuitive, if you kind of compare those two, the risk of lock-in and just the number of, the amount of compute that you would do at the storage and compute layer is, I think, always going to be greater. And so as you kind of continue to develop more and more, and whether it's Google, Azure, or Amazon, as they continue to kind of provide services, those services and all that, the amount of work that's done is going to be greater at that layer, I think, than at the edge layer. And so I think it's a question of kind of where the most amount of work is being done, and it's after we demoed edge workers, I suppose. But there's still going to be I think a disproportionate, and certainly now there's a disproportionate amount of work being done at the storage and compute level. As long as that's the case, I think the lock-in is going to be greater there. For someday we'll be as big as Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. I'm kidding, but there's also that piece as well, right? Which is, I think you're dealing with enormous technology companies, and there's a difference there, I think, in terms of the lock-in too. So does that answer your question? Is that a fair answer?
Stopia, just wondering if you have a sense of, or if there's a best practice for, at what scale does orchestration and containerization and all that kind of stuff make sense? Because there is a penalty for the management side of it. It's a different way of doing it, but you still have manifests and configuration files and everything else. At what point is it worth investing in that?
It kind of, for me, I've seen companies with 10 people do this really well. I've seen companies with 20 people do this really well. It is a paradigm shift. So if you're in this old, previous model, you're right. Everyone has to change their mind about things. But at the end of the day, it's better for the developers. It's better for DevOps. It moves around the responsibilities, and it makes them easier to handle. I don't think there is a perfect point, but there is a point where you realize it is something you should be looking into. And I think that is for any company. Those 10-person companies, they can move quickly and deploy services quickly and make sure that they're up and running because they moved to this model or they built on top of it. It is a different thing when you're saying, I've built this other way and now I need to move to the containerization orchestration model. And that's when you start looking at small POCs, moving on the cloud, making it easier, doing it on premise, just moving to that orchestration model. Like we have Container Engine, we try to make it as easy as possible. I usually tell people that. Move one little service and try that out, and then we can build on top of that. There's no perfect point.
Yeah, so one question one could ask himself would be, how much pain is a certain piece in the current way of deploying software causing us as an organization? And just start with automating that and moving this particular piece into, I don't know, something fancy, basically, and just extending it, where you start with a simple POC and you expand into glorious pipelines and whatnot.
Yeah, to that point, you're right. It's, you start moving to Jenkins, or maybe you're already using Jenkins and you're using VMs at that point. Then you start thinking, hey, actually, instead of using VMs, let's use containers for some of these, and building that immutable infrastructure that is then built on top of containers. You can start doing that. You're right. Having that pipeline is great. You just kick those jobs off, bake those things, and you don't really have to worry about them at all.
So we are out of time. Thank you both for being here and for a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks.